All right, welcome my friends. If this were a college course, I would probably call this slideshow something like the Prolegomena of studying history. It's questions we want to ask beforehand. And in the process of getting ready to study either American history or world history, we want to be able to see what it is that it's important to get out of what we're learning. And so I've got 7 questions here that I'd like to go through. How does history move? Is there meaning to history? Does history show a cure for man's moral problems? What can we learn about God from his actions in history? What can we learn about ourselves from man's actions in history? Is there truth to be discovered? And how will studying history help me grow personally? So those are my 7 questions. We're going to take them each in turn, describe them a little bit so you can kind of see the perspective, the angle by which we'll be approaching the different eras of history. So the first question we had was, how does history move? In other words, things are always changing, and now it seems like things are changing more than ever. So we could look at it in a couple of different ways. Idealism would say that history moves by thesis, making a statement and then moving toward the opposite, kind of like a pendulum swing. But when it comes back to the middle, there is an improved synthesis that becomes our thesis. This is what philosophers will call Hegelian idealism. But it assumes that we are always making progress. By our turn to the left and our turn to the right, we will keep moving forward, and it provides us with a kind of unbridled optimism. We're always progressing toward a utopian end. That's one way of looking at the change that's coming. Another way is, and this will be my approach as we go through history, looking at history as stewardship. How we remain faithful, or in what ways we veer to the right or to the left. And so our movement we'll talk about is a moral change. So we are either moving closer in faithfulness or we're moving farther away from those rules that are objective. So we're talking about faithfulness or unfaithfulness. Our next question is there meaning to history? In other words, if you talk to some people, they will describe all meaning as whether or not it matters to you. There is meaning that you have, and your meaning is local. It might be tribal. It's the people that you hang around. You guys know what truth is for you, but it's different what truth is for me and the people that I hang around. So meaning is subjective. It doesn't really exist. It's whatever you assign your reality and whatever I assign my reality. So that's kind of a postmodernist view of meaning to history. The problem is, for me, that means there's no actual meaning. It's whatever I assign to it, or whatever you assign to it, or whatever somebody in power can assign to it, but it will only last for as long as that power and authority last, and then it'll go away. I want to know what is truly true. Francis Schaeffer called it true truth, because we wanted to say in the midst of a bunch of subjective things, truth was objective. And so then our task becomes what we've put here as conservatism. What ideas throughout the unfolding of history, what ideas should be preserved? Which things should we hold dear? Which things should we, like a baton, put into the hands of the next generation in this relay from the past to the future? It's the part we play. We're the link in the chain that makes sure what is important from the past gets into the hands of the future. So we ask ourselves, so what is good? What is true? What is beautiful? And that's what we'll be wanting to conserve. That's what we'll be wanting to preserve. That's the water that we'll carry from the past into the future. So we'll have to ask ourselves, is there meaning to history? And then as we answer that question, we'll watch how people who answer the question the way that we did, how that worked out for them. So that's one of our questions as we get started with the study of history. Here's another one. Does history show a cure for man's moral problems? In other words, we all have to admit as we're looking around that man doesn't always make good decisions. We might even be in conflict as to how those decisions ought to have played out. So our question becomes then, is there a cure? Will we always be in conflict? What is the shape of man's problem? Some will say, oh, it's ignorance. If only we could provide the proper education, feed the students in one end of the factory and have outcome being good citizens, good people. So education, if we could just overcome man's ignorance. It might be more than that. It might be more central than that. It might be deeper than that. We might need a full kind of transformation. And so we would talk about maybe how that could come about. So our question is, we'll ask, people will present different solutions for man's moral problems, but our question will be, did it work? So that's the next question. Then what can we learn about God from his actions in society? What provides for social order or for disorder? What allows man to thrive? Those are the rules by which we would say the Creator has built into the moral fabric of man and in society. So what is tended toward order? What is tended toward disorder? Another thing we could learn about God from his actions in society is his providence. How he has undertaken to reveal himself to societies, how societies have responded, and how there is, or is not, as the case may be, a meta-narrative, an overarching story moving from beginning to end. That's providence. And then we will sometimes see things that we almost have to admit are miracles, and they are divine intervention. I love listening to David McCullough and talking about our American Revolution. And every once in a while he'll say something like, in the retreat out of New York, if the British had pressed the point, they would have destroyed the army and the American Revolution would have ended right there. But George Washington was able to get an organized retreat out in the middle of the night, across the river to the other side without losing a man, without losing any equipment, and without the British noticing, so that in the morning they would notice that the army had just vanished. And there was a fog that came in, an unnatural fog, the people wrote. The historians and the people who had been there at the time, they said this isn't normal. This provided cover for George Washington to get the entire army out. Another case in the American Revolution was the Battle of Sixpens, and in that case there was a flood that stood in the way of American defeat and instead brought about something quite different. And so we can learn and we can look at these things and we can ask ourselves, is this coincidence or is it something more? What can we learn about ourselves then, about man's actions in society? We can learn what brings about social cohesion or civil unrest. What is man worship? Man seems to be a worshiping man. What is it that he sells his life for, his soul? And then what examples in history can we find of goodness or character or heroism, times when wisdom won the day? That's what we'll be looking for in the lives of the people. We'll look at them and we will learn from them, because as Patrick Henry said, he has no idea of how to judge the future but by the past. And looking at the notable deeds of these men and women, actors in society, then we will learn from their experience, and instead of it being me learning by experience, I can have a whole lifetime of experience stretched out vicariously. I could choose, and history will be my tutor so that I don't have to go through all the failures and the successes of experience. I can learn from them and I can avoid the pitfalls then. So there are things to be learned from our own actions in society. There is truth to be discovered. We will watch historical patterns play out such that always and every time we do the wrong thing in the wrong way, we get the same result. And so we're looking at the patterns and saying, this thing is designed, this historical story, there's something going on here. Objective truth, then if something truly exists, then its existence, its truth is eternal, whether we believe it or not. Objective truth is eternal, and so that truth implies a knowledge of God. There is truth in history to be discovered, and we're going to go chase that this year. And then finally, how will studying history help me grow personally? I watched an interview. It was for the 250th anniversary. NPR put together a bunch of interviews that Charlie Rose had done with David McCullough. David McCullough is a great historian, wrote books like John Adams, 1776, and several other books. And so they put together this collection. And what I noticed right in one of the interviews that they had with him, he said, you know what? And he talked as if the people that he had studied in history were actually living, breathing people that he had interacted with. And he says, it is such a privilege to keep company with these people. So the cool thing about us studying history is we're going to get back and walk for a while in the shoes of Solomon, of Socrates, of Caesar, of Christ, of any number of historical characters. We'll watch Luther going through a plague and trying to decide whether he should leave town in order to be safe or whether he should stay and try to minister. We'll see the actors of history playing out, and as David McCullough says, it is such a privilege to hang out with those kinds of people and to learn from them. He also says something interesting in the interview. He said, I see more clearly than I did before. History provides some clarity for us, some ability to see, ability to understand our times, and even more to be able to take steps in the way that we ought to go because we see more clearly. And then his last thing that I listened to and took to heart was he was talking about the American founders, and he was saying they had such a sense of destiny, as if they had been created for such a time as this, and they were going to play this out not because they wanted to be successful, but because they were setting an example for the next generations who would come. And then he said, we ought to have that same kind of mentality, that we have been placed where we are for such a time as this, and we too are being judged by history. So those are our questions as we get going. I hope that I've sort of whetted your appetite for what it is that we're going to be taking a look at. Join me again soon as we continue this year in looking at the history that will unfold before us. Thanks for joining me.